QSO Today, episode 487, Jonathan Taylor, K1RFD. This episode of QSO Today is listener-sponsored. Only you can keep the QSO Today podcast coming to you every weekend since 2014. Please become a listener sponsor monthly or annually by clicking on the sponsor banner on the show notes page or at the top of the QSO Today webpage. I want to thank this week's new or renewal listener sponsors that include Chuck Lucas, W5GX, Rod Wilson, VE3RXN, Ken Bettinia, VA7WY, and Joey Smith, N4VFA. This week's donors were Jim Fisher, KD7KTV, $20, and Rachel Cogent, K5ZN, $10. We received additional donations from anonymous donors and want to thank them for supporting the QSO Today project. Sponsorships and donations are automatically posted to the QSO Today show notes page in real time. My thanks to all of you who listen and support QSO Today. Welcome to the QSO Today podcast. I'm Eric Guth, amateur call sign 4Z1UG, where I demonstrate the diversity and relevance of the amateur radio hobby and its impact on society by interviewing ham radio operators, many of whom played vital roles in shaping our technology through the amateur radio hobby. And while many people might say, ham radio? Do people still do that? This podcast demonstrates through in-depth interviews just how amazing, diverse, and dynamic the amateur radio hobby continues to be. Jonathan Taylor, K1RFD, has reached his 50th year as a ham radio operator. He is the creator of Echolink, the first amateur radio voice-over internet service linking amateur radio stations, the receiver of Technical Innovation Awards, and author of VoIP, Internet Linking for Radio Amateurs, now in its second edition. K1RFD checks all of the ham radio boxes for operating, homebrewing, software development, radio restoration, and is my QSO Today. K1RFD, this is Eric, 4Z1UG. Are you there, Jonathan?
4Z1UG, this is K1RFD. How are you?
I'm fine, Jonathan, and you?
I'm doing well.
So it's a rainy, almost snowy day here in Efrat, or the evening in Efrat, and you are where?
I'm in southwestern Connecticut, so I'm just northeast of New York City in a very bucolic New England town called Ridgefield, which I love. I've been here for 24 years, although I'm originally from, I guess, sort of the pseudo-Midwest, from the east side of Cleveland, Ohio, which is where I grew up.
The east side of, so is that still Cleveland, or is it something like Conneaut or some?
It's not quite as far as Conneaut, but I lived in a suburb, I guess originally it was a streetcar suburb called Cleveland Heights, which is just on the east edge of Cleveland. It was a good place to grow up.
It sounds like a great place to grow up. Although I've been in Conneaut during the winter, and I can tell you that's a cold place.
It's cold, and also all those communities along Lake Erie that are northeast of Cleveland get a lot of snow because the weather patterns, the same reason Buffalo gets snow. The weather patterns bring all that moist air in the winter over and just dump it on that part of the north coast of America. So I was right at the edge of the snow belt.
And it's the wind coming off the lake is probably pretty cold too.
Sure.
Yeah, it gives you a nice wind chill factor.
That's right. It's what finally drove my father out of Cleveland. He had to walk to work right at the edge of Lake Erie. And even though he grew up there, he finally moved to Virginia just to get away from the climate.
Well, we hear that, people who are in the East become snowbirds when they're old enough to retire, perhaps. Let's start at the beginning of your ham radio story, because I know that you started as a kid. When and how did it start for you?
So it actually started very early. I got a great Christmas present one year when I was in second grade. So I guess I would have been about 7 or 8 years old. And it was one of those Norelco electronic kits. I think they called it Electronic Engineer. And it was, it actually came with a whole set of parts: resistors, capacitors, transistors, a few miscellaneous switches and lights. And you'd have a sort of a pegboard that you put a circuit template on top of, and then you would build the circuit on top of this. And you could build a radio or an electric organ or something. And I love that thing. Yeah, it had spring clips. And I have looked, as many people do, I've looked for this kind of thing on eBay and found a couple of examples of it just to remember what it looks like. And it was just such a great experience for such a young kid to be able to actually build things without doing any soldering, to build things that actually worked. And I remember bringing it into my second grade class for show and tell, a working radio. That was kind of fun. And everybody in the classroom would walk up and put the earphone in their ear and hear the radio. So it wasn't ham radio, but it was electronics. And that was sort of the first thing that I got interested in. And then my grandfather, who had some similar interests, gave me an old Hallicrafters tube type portable shortwave set. It was an S72L. It's probably from the early 1950s, maybe. And that was my first real shortwave receiver.
Now you say that's a portable, right? So it had portable. It had multiple different kinds of batteries in it. Like there was like a 45-volt battery or something.
That's right. You couldn't buy the batteries anymore, so I never had a battery for it. But yes, there was room inside the wooden cabinet to put these large batteries, probably an A battery and a B battery at least. It had tubes that had 1-volt filaments that I think were all wired in series. And even though I never ran it on a battery, I could see that it would work that way. But it had 4 bands, I remember, long wave, medium wave, and 2 shortwave bands. Notably, the BFO never worked. So I was never able to really listen to CW or sideband. But I enjoyed listening to the shortwave stations. They were outside of the ham band, and I was very interested in improving the antennas and all that. And that's really the first time that I got interested in listening on the radio to shortwave broadcasts.
And did you become a serious shortwave listener? I mean, did you go after QSL cards? And
No, I didn't. So this would have been when I was maybe about 11 at this point. And I didn't know anybody who was a ham operator at that time. But then in my 7th grade class, after I switched schools, I discovered that not one, but 2 teachers at my small private school were hams, and they were trying to get a radio club going. So that was my first introduction to ham radio. I had read some books from the library about ham radio before. There was a series of books that probably go way back. They were probably old when I took them out of the library in 1972, called The Boy's First Book of Radio and Electronics and The Boy's Second Book. That's right, Alfred E. Morgan. So you've seen these books, and they're great. They're probably from the late 50s. And of course, they had only tube-type projects in them. But it was great. You built a little 2-tube radio on a wooden board. And I never completed most of those projects, but I was very interested from that.
Were there other kids besides you that had an interest in at the same time?
Yeah, there were a few. And I remember one other guy who also ended up getting his novice license at the same time I did. Just to fast forward about a year, I took my novice exam, both code and written, on the dining room table of one of the teachers, and got to see his station on that same day. And this would have been October of 74, so it was just before I turned 13. And that was the beginning. In those days, it took a little while before you got your license, though. You had to be very patient and wait like 5 weeks for the FCC to get its act together. So I finally got on the air in December of 74 with a combination of a DX60 that I had bought secondhand from an older friend, which I was totally afraid to even turn on until I got my license. And then I had saved enough money to actually go to the Heathkit store in Cleveland. They actually had a store. And I purchased an HR-10B kit and spent probably 48 continuous hours, sleepless hours building it, because that was my ticket to getting on the air. So it actually did work the first time. So
did you have the right tools?
I apparently had the right tool for that. I must have done some soldering before I got the kit, so I was ready to go.
No, so you're in your 50th year then of ham radio coming up.
That's right. So it'll be 50 years this December.
Did ham radio play a part in the choices that you made for your education and career?
Definitely. It really reinforced my interest in just all things technical. And I think some people are just sort of wired for that. There's a lot of very smart people who aren't, by the way, as you probably know. But I was very interested in anything mechanical and electrical, and especially in building things and making them work and learning about lots of things like, how to send and receive Morse code and so on, and then how to make antennas. The radio club at school was thriving at the time. We had a station set up there, and I made a lot of friends in the ham community. Even as a teenager, I got very interested in, for example, traffic handling formal message traffic on CW. And that continued when I went to college. And it definitely affected my choices of colleges and my interest in majors. I ended up majoring in electrical engineering, probably reinforced by my ham experience.
They're in Cleveland, because I think wasn't there the Cleveland Institute of Engineering or something like that?
So the biggest engineering school in Cleveland is actually Case Western Reserve University. I didn't go to Case. I went to Cornell in upstate New York.
And you did a BSCE there?
So I actually started, that's the beginning of another story, but I started as an engineering major. But about halfway through college, I got very interested in the campus radio station, which was actually off campus. It was entirely owned and operated by Cornell students, still is actually to this day. And I discovered my other real love, which is radio announcing. So I learned how to write and deliver newscasts and how to produce commercials and how to be a DJ. And that ended up being not only my final major at Cornell Communications, but also my original career. And I spent about 7 years full-time as a professional broadcaster before going back into technology.
Do you have to have a low voice in order to be a broadcaster?
I guess it helped. Yeah, although if you listen to the radio nowadays, I think the old-time announcer voice is mostly a thing of the past. Unless you listen to the oldies stations, then it's still there. But I think the modern approach to broadcasting is much more conversational and in some formats very, very up and hyped.
Did you have broadcast idols, people that you thought were the cream of the cream?
I sure did. I mean, we used to be able to, I never spent any time in New York City until I was older, but you could hear some of the New York City radio stations over our feed from Ithaca, New York, over the satellite feed that delivered us the national news. And they would have, you could listen to WNBC over this feed, especially in the morning. And the guy I worked with in Ithaca, New York at WVBR, and we would listen to this closed circuit thing sort of in between songs and listen to Don Imus and Charles McCord on WNBC.
I heard Don Imus in Los Angeles. He was an NBC affiliate, so he was probably syndicated all over the place.
Imus actually was on the air in Cleveland for a while before he moved to New York.
He became a solo act. He was on in the morning. He was a morning drive show.
Yeah, Imus in the morning. Charles McCord was the newscaster.
Okay. So he broke in periodically for the news up.
Yeah, they would have some banter going on. And McCord wrote all the funny bits that they did as well. So, yeah, that was one of the legends. And also some of the other people from New York, right, like Ron Lundy. And
Gene Shepard was gone by that time,
I don't remember hearing Gene Shepard on the air, so that might have been.
Because I think he was more popular in the late 50s, early 60s.
I think he was, and he might have been on WOR in New York, which is the station that I ended up working at eventually, sort of toward the end of my career. And I was aware of other sort of, famous people who had worked there, some of whom actually had pictures up in the hallway.
So you got to WR in New York. Were you an on-air talent?
I was. I did I'm not sure I'd use the word talent, but I was on the air. I was a newscaster. I usually did the evenings. And I was aware that I actually had worked at two different, clear channel 50,000 watt AM stations, the first one being WHAM in Rochester. And one interesting thing for a ham is that at both of those stations, they would receive QSL cards from listeners. I guess they'd be called medium wave listeners all over the world. I remember getting a card at WHAM that had a transcript of a newscast I had done before sunrise in Rochester, New York, that was picked up in Sydney, Australia on 1180 kilohertz. So that was pretty cool. I wish I had a copy of that QSL card still.
Did they also want a card in return? And did the station have cards in return to send to people?
I don't recall, but I hope we responded with a card. That would have been the right thing to do.
It would be the right thing to do.
Yeah. So the engineering at both of those stations was very interesting. And I know this is a little bit of a sidebar, but WHAM is, 50,000 watts omnidirectional day and night, which is a little bit unusual. Just a big vertical antenna in the middle of a swamp on the southwest side of Rochester. The stations in New York, with the exception of WNBC, I think, were all directional, even though they were still clear channel. So, WOR had an antenna array out in the New Jersey Meadowlands. And I remember talking to the engineering staff, which was quite substantial at that station at the time, about all the maintenance they had to do on keeping that array in line with FCC regulations. So it was a good glimpse into what sort of quote unquote professional radio is all about as well.
Did you also do the engineering side?
I didn't do very much engineering except at the college station. I did some, but I was mostly, I would occasionally get in trouble for trying to do some engineering, especially at a union shop like we have in New York. But when I was at KISS FM, which is the FM side of the RKO stations in New York at the time, in the same building, 1440 Broadway, I was the production director, not a newscaster. So I did a combination of audio engineering and announcing at that point.
And what happened after that?
So after I
is there a limited life, for this kind of job there?
Yeah. So, well, I felt like by the time I had done a couple of years at WOR, I was getting a little bit burned out, and I got to be more interested in the newsroom computer than in the actual news that was coming over the computer. And I figured that was my cue to get back into technology. I had a lot of things I wanted to do that I was interested in. And I took a big gamble at that point and got in touch with a couple of headhunters and got my resume together and tried to find a job as basically a software developer, as a programmer. And I had done a lot of this as sort of a hobby thing during this time. And I finally got a bite from a startup company in White Plains, New York called Prodigy Services Company, which was one of the very early online services before the internet became popular.
The 5-inch floppy disk came in at the grocery store, I think.
So you could buy a Prodigy startup kit at Sears, which was one of the investors. It was originally a joint venture among Sears, IBM, and CBS. But we did compete with America Online, which is where a lot of those disks came from, the AOL disks. Although it's interesting because one of the things that we did at Prodigy that was innovative was we ran ads on the service, which was very unusual at that time. So when you logged into Prodigy, you'd get an ad slot at the bottom of the screen. And one of the things that we advertised was, well, just to back up a second, the challenge at that time was not that people didn't have PCs. The problem was people didn't have modems for their PCs. And of course, you needed a modem. So we tried to sell modems. In fact, we sold a package that had the software and a modem in the same box. And we ended up taking ads for this little Macintosh bulletin board service based in Northern Virginia called America Online, because we figured the more modems that end up in the marketing channel, the better. They would never be a serious competitor to us. Well, a few years later, they were eating our lunch.
I remember that time. There was a competition for the portal. The idea was that if people connected through you, that you would have the portal that would control all that they see and hear, display ads. And I think for the most part, American Online may still, if it still exists, I think it still exists, may still be doing that. And it's users who are in their 90s, perhaps, who are still on there, think that's the way the internet actually works. Yeah,
that's true. You're absolutely right about the sort of the race for the portal, because that was the big buzzword when the internet first became popular. So Prodigy was a very sort of closed system and a very closed culture where we figured we had to invent everything ourselves. We never took any existing standard and applied it somewhere, partly because there weren't very many standards to choose from at that time.
Right, it was Old West out there.
It was, which was a great experience. It was very ham radio-ish, actually, because you built everything yourself. You never borrowed something from somebody else. You got in there with your virtual soldering iron and wrote software in C from the ground up and made something work. And I loved that culture. And one of the things that I did when I was there was actually to write one of the early web browsers that would actually run on the Prodigy software. And for several shining months, probably in the early part of 1995, it was actually the most commonly used web browser before Netscape Navigator came on.
And what was it called?
It was called the Prodigy web browser.
Really? Oh, how about that?
Yeah, and it only worked with a very primitive subset of HTML, which is all there was at that time. This is before JavaScript and so on. So we ran with that for a while because it was very easy for people to install. It sort of was automatic because it was part of a closed system. But you could access sites, websites through it.
I think I remember those. Was it Microsoft had some kind of software for making a website using HTML?
There were a few, yes. There were a few. There weren't a lot, yeah. Because the whole thing, the big push there was everybody should have their personal web page. So there were various companies that were offering easy ways for you to onboard your own web page. It was sort of a status symbol if you had your own webpage.
What were you doing in ham radio at the same time? Were you still quite active in ham radio?
I wasn't doing a whole lot with ham radio at that time. I was pretty active at that time. I was living in an apartment, so I didn't have a great place to put up HF antennas. But I stayed active on 2 meters. I would chat to people on the way to work and on the way from work during drive times on 2 meters. So I got to know a lot of the local people. But it wasn't really until I moved to Connecticut and bought a house here in Ridgefield in the year 2000 that I got sort of back into ham radio in a big way, and unpacked my equipment and set up antennas and got back on the air and got interested in the idea of developing amateur radio software as well, because I thought that would be a sort of a nice niche to be into.
One that you could probably make millions of dollars in. I think for ham radio has learned.
Yeah, there's not a whole lot of there's not big budgets in ham radio, but it's mostly a labor of love.
So what happened to Prodigy in the end? It got eaten.
Yeah, so I ended up leaving Prodigy and starting my own. I actually went to a startup company for a little while, which didn't get very far, and I started doing my own consulting work. But Prodigy never figured out how to adapt to the internet, I think is the main thing. There was, I remember the discussions in the hallways at the time where, there's this internet thing. How can we connect to it? As if it was just sort of this accessory that would be an extra feature to be added onto Prodigy. When the real question should have been, how can the internet connect to us? And I think that just because of the corporate culture there, and this has been discussed to death, there were lots of talented people there, but I think they just couldn't quite see the end game with the internet. And in the internet, as you know, sort of leveled the playing field. There were lots and lots of options when you got into the internet. You didn't have to depend on a company to handle your online presence. We owned modem racks all over the country. Well, that was a very obsolete business model.
Well, you had modem racks interconnected with T1s or DS48s or whatever.
We actually had a 56 kilobit backbone, which was considered fast.
Oh, interesting. Oh, I mean, you're talking about from the modem user to the mainframe, or you're talking about in between
between the points of presence was actually 56K lines. There are probably several of them for a given point of presence, but we're only working with modems that would go at 2400 baud at the time. So anyway. Nowadays,
we take for granted the infrastructure that exists. But in those days, getting to the internet, which I think was the connections between universities, that you might have had to have a connection to a university to get to their POP, or knew somebody that said, well, they're relaxing the conditions, and if you're near 49 Hudson Street, maybe we can give you something. What I'm saying is like I remember it being kind of like. As you're saying, nobody actually even knew what questions to ask in order to be able to, make the connection.
Well, I remember one of my first questions is, who owns this thing?
Yeah, what is it? Yeah.
It was very hard to get an answer to that.
Who pays for it? Why isn't the University of California gets connected, and who pays for it?
And it's true that in the early days of consumer-oriented internet access, it was quite expensive. I remember there was a product called Internet in a Box, which was what we would call a stack and dialer. It would run on a PC. And it cost $10 an hour to connect to it. So I remember doing stuff and trying to just be very quick and get off, downloading and then read stuff offline before logging in again.
Well, I think CompuServe was like that.
CompuServe was like that. It wasn't quite that expensive, but it wasn't
similar. Expensive, but you do the same thing. You'd log in and log
charge
off.
By the hour. Yeah.
Right.
So to your point, internet access was both difficult, slow, and expensive, and storage was expensive also.
Did it exist?
I mean, disk space in general. You think about hard drive PCs. Yeah.
That's my first laptop I still have it actually, a Toshiba with a 30 meg hard drive.
And it was probably considered big at the time. It was probably pretty expensive too.
And now this break. The QSO Today project that includes this podcast and the QSO Today Academy is now listener-sponsored. There are no commercial sponsors to influence the content and opinions expressed on QSO Today, including my blog posts. Disclaimer: we did not have a problem with sponsor influence when we did have commercial sponsors. The world is different now. I believe that commercial sponsorship, where you watch and listen to TV, radio, YouTube, Facebook, and X for free, does give sponsors complete control over all that you see and hear. The largest networks are now dominated by international corporations who decide in their boardrooms what we hear, know about, how we vote, and what we buy. Commercial sponsorship models for podcasts don't work, maybe for good reasons. At QSO Today, we are back to blogging and podcasting for the free expression of ideas, discussion, and the dissemination of content without commercial sponsorship. It takes everyone's ideas and approaches in our discussions to formulate our own way, with the best information available. This has always been the best formula for success, even in ham radio. So QSO Today is now value for value, following the model created by another ham, Adam Curry, K5AAC, inventor of podcasting and the value for value business model. I create valuable amateur radio content that you consume. In return, you find it valuable, then you reward the podcast with your sponsorships, donations, transcription sponsorships, and using the QSO Today Amazon link. Your supporting the podcast in this way keeps QSO Today podcasts coming to you every week since July of 2014, now approaching 500 episodes. In addition, we have over 500 educational ham radio videos from previous QSO Today Virtual Ham Expos that we also publish to allow every ham to benefit from these excellent presentations. However, all of this content has to be produced, edited, curated, and hosted on commercial platforms by me and my team to keep it easily accessible and available to you. Links and banners on the show notes pages allow you to show your support of the QSO Today project. Please support QSO Today with your sponsorships, donations, and using our Amazon links. And now back to our QSO Today. It's my understanding that you received some technical innovation awards from the ARRL in 2002, and you also received the Hamvention Special Achievement Award in 2003. What was this amateur radio achievement that you brought to ham radio that caused you to be the receiver of these prestigious awards?
Well, that story begins when I started working on some software projects. I used to be friends with the folks at a company called West Mountain Radio, which was based in Norwalk, Connecticut. These are guys I knew from the Ham Radio Club, and they were building a thing called a Rig Blaster, which is a PC to radio interface because of the rise in digital modes. You could do RTTY from your PC, and there was PSK31 came along, and there were lots of digital modes. And they started thinking about other things that a Rig Blaster could be used for, and came up with the idea of, how about you have something that can, on a schedule, automatically run on your PC, check to see if the local repeater is not busy, and jump on and do a 30-second voice announcement about a club meeting coming up. It's sort of like a club announcement machine. So I developed this program called Echo Station, which it's actually still available. It was written originally for Windows 95, which does just this. It would work through a Rig Blaster and do voice announcements over the local repeater. Well, I started getting email at the time about, that's kind of cool. I can also use this as my repeater controller, and it does work that way. But is there any way you can hook it into one of these voice over IP systems? There's this thing called the Internet Radio Linking Project going, which runs on Linux, but is there a way for you to tap into that with Echo Station so that we could have the two work together? And I remember some correspondence with RLP about that, and it sounded like that wasn't really going to go anywhere. But it got me to thinking about other PC applications that would make it easy to set up this sort of repeater linking thing on a PC. At that time, there was a project kicking around called iLink. In fact, it was featured in a QST magazine article, which was an easy way to run something that would do internet linking on a PC. The problem is that even though it was wildly popular, the developer had kind of abandoned the project, and there wasn't a lot of support for it. So I ended up creating something that was compatible with it, that would give you sort of a software alternative, which I originally was going to call Hamlink, but I ended up calling it Echolink. And that was released in the spring of 2002. And then that sort of took off. I think people found it very easy to get started on that and appreciated some of the features of that software. And I ended up, this is now, it's 22 years has gone by. that ended up being a continuous effort of supporting and upgrading that software. And and the awards you were just mentioning were in recognition of the release of that.
Of Echolink.
Yeah.
And Echolink, I think, ended up having thousands of users.
So I remember being amazed when we had more than 100 users online when I first started working on this, and it kept growing. I don't recall the numbers right now, but I think the user base is around 360,000 now. There was a time in 2002, 2003, where we, which means me and a couple other volunteers, were getting about 250 applications per 24 hours for new users, all of which had to be manually vetted, by the way, because it's very tight on security. So 250 users every day, 365 days a year for several years.
What kind of feedback did you get from users or from the general ham community about whether Echolink was ham radio?
Yeah, this was a pretty hot topic, especially in the beginning. So in thinking back now to 2002, 2003, when this was really a novelty. And there were a few things going on. One was some people were just really amazed that it was so cool that you could, on your local repeater, you could hear people from California and Australia that were thousands of miles away and sounded like they were just, using the same repeater locally. And there was a lot of interest in that. And frankly, it was kind of cool to be able to do that. I think people also appreciated with Echolink, especially, that you could access it from your PC. So you would have sort of like having a remote base access to your local repeater. And I think that's still some of the attraction. But then, yes, there was a lot of discussion about, well, this isn't ham radio. You're using the internet. The internet's a bad thing. Don't use the internet. Use ham radio. And I totally understand that mindset. I think in some ways, back in the 50s and 60s, if you had a ham radio station, you were one of the superstars in your neighborhood. You had a superpower.
Right.
You could talk to people for free in Africa, in Asia, and all over the place. And that was an amazing thing to be able to do without a telephone, and at any time. But as technology marches along, communications has gotten so much simpler and ubiquitous and cheaper. And of course, now we're all walking around with devices in our pockets, which not only can, answer have all the world's knowledge at your fingertips and again, can answer any question, but also gives you instant access to any other person around the world. And where does ham radio fit into all this, And what I would tell people is let's not be afraid of this. Let's figure out a way to embrace it, because the best value that we can give, besides, of course, providing communications when the internet is not available in certain disaster situations, but is also to figure out what are the best hybrids of this technology. How can we find a way to use amateur radio and the internet in a way that adds value to both of them? And the idea is to think of it as a hybrid technology, where you can think of, even in a disaster scenario, where amateur radio provides the sort of the last mile of the communication, but the internet provides the long haul. And we're sort of using both of those things to their best advantage. And I think that thinking about it that way is much more comfortable than thinking about a competition between amateur radio and internet technology.
Now, was Echolink, at least in the early iterations of it, using the Rig Blaster devices to go PC to radio so that, in fact, somebody could talk on a repeater in another country?
That's right. In fact, that's still the primary use case. That's what it's really tuned for, is gateways. I call them sysop nodes, but it's basically a PC connected to a transceiver, which is tuned to the frequency pair of a local repeater.
So you're not actually, the repeater itself is not the Echolink node.
It doesn't have to be. I mean, often the challenge with that is that a lot of repeater sites don't have good internet access. And it's easier to set up a node at somebody's home station where they can keep it on all the time and they're in good range of the repeater. It's true that for the sort of cleanest kind of connection, it's better to connect it to the repeater controller directly, but it doesn't have to be that way. And I think those are actually the minority of cases. And that's probably also true of the other VoIP systems like IRLP and All-Star as well.
Speaking for All-Star, it makes an amazing repeater controller.
Well, Asterisk is a very flexible, virtual PBX. And it's a very natural fit to add DAP-RPT, the ham radio plugin for Asterisk, And then the Echolink channel driver will also run on that. So you get access to the Echolink network as well as the app RPT/asterisk network.
Also, well, that's very interesting. And is there some control capability at the end of the node? Meaning, if I connect to someone else's Echolink station talking to a repeater, do I have any control over that station other than push to talk?
So it's a good question, and it also brings up sort of a question I'm often asked about legality as to whether the person at the other end is becoming the control operator of the station. Generally, no, there isn't a lot of remote control capability built in. There is remote control for the owner of the node. You can log into, it's basically a built-in web server inside of the software so that you can bring the node up, take it down, do that sort of things, make connections. But the remote user is not expected to be a control operator of the node itself. So normally wouldn't have control over frequency or power or things like that.
And does the node owner actually can he whitelist or blacklist?
Yeah. You can set up security either to have a specific list of allowed call signs or a specific list of deny call signs. And you can also filter it by country code and also by the type of node that's connected, because Echolink recognizes that there's at least two types of nodes, because we have, the ones that are just you talking using your smartphone or your PC versus the gateway nodes that we just discussed. And they sort of have different operational characteristics.
Does Echolink work with network radios that have push-to-talk buttons?
Yes. In fact, I thought I had one right here.
All-Star doesn't. I mean, you have to use, I think, DV switch or something like that. You have to go through some intermediate device in order to be able to do that. But does natively, if I have an Android-based network portable, can I just run Echolink natively on it?
Yeah, you can. In fact, it's designed to work with the hardware push-to-talk switch on some of those devices as well. And those are devices that run a version of Android. There's 4 editions of the Echolink software that I maintain. There's the original Windows PC version. There's also one for Android. There's one for iOS. And then there's another one which runs inside of a web browser, cross-platform.
What can we expect in Echolink in the next year or two that you think is innovative, or maybe it's a new feature? And do you see Echolink as being like competitive with IRLP or All-Star or any of the other amateur radio voice over IP modes?
So there's a lot of interconnection of stations over the internet now due to digital technologies. So WiresX and DMR and so on all have their own, I guess, somewhat proprietary protocols to be able to interconnect. So that the analog voice over IP is not nearly as unique as it once was. Yes, the major systems are still Echolink, IRLP, and the asterisk app RPT All-Star system. Right now, they're actually complementary. There's a lot of interconnection among those 3 systems, and it's mostly worked out pretty well. There's a lot of nets that meet that have people using all 3 technologies at the same time, which is a good thing, I guess. There's a little bit of loss between them as they transcode their audio. They're using different protocols, they're using different sample rates, different codecs, but there are ways to connect them at the analog level, which have been successful. In terms of the roadmap, I'm mostly doing a lot of sort of enhancements and fixes at this point. I retired last year, which gives me a lot more time to play around with this. And I've been trying to, for example, that 4th platform, the web platform, is brand new as of just a few weeks ago. And that's something that I think I'm going to keep working on, try to do things like, better localization so that the apps use the local language in their native controls and labels, to do a little bit more excellence around the connection reliability, and just try to basically improve the system rather than making revolutionary steps right now.
If I had a full duplex radio at the other end, I'm talking on the input and output of a repeater. I've got full duplex mobile or something like that. Will it do full duplex back to the user remotely controlling?
So the audio in Echolink is half duplex by design, recognizing the fact that most rigs that it's connected to are also half duplex. In fact, even a repeater, if you think about it, is half duplex. The reason for that is to ensure that there's an interlock there. There was a lot of conversation about this 20 years ago as to whether it should be full duplex. And my decision at the time was to not complicate it with that, because there would be so few actual full duplex nodes. Now I realize that there actually are some advantages depending on the context and the use case that would make it better to have audio in both directions. But right now it's not supported.
I actually like full duplex because it allows me to actually hear, how good the station I'm talking through is actually getting into wherever I'm going.
Well, it's more like this conversation, right? It's not, you're not taking turns transmitting. But ham radio is mostly about taking turns transmitting. And in recognition of that and the fact that it's really geared toward FM transceivers, that was the reason for that design point.
You are the author of the ARRL book, VoIP, Internet Linking for Radio Amateurs, first and second editions. What is the status of this book, and do you expect a third edition?
So there were two editions of the book about VoIP systems, which includes not just Echolink, but also the others that have been around, like RLP and so on. The ARRL did two editions of that with me, but that was it. So the book is out of print right now. There was some conversation about doing a third edition, but it never got off the ground, at least not yet.
Oh, I see. And would you do a third edition?
Yeah, in a way, it could be a bigger book than it was in 2004, 2006. So yes, I think there is.
The whole Raspberry Pi thing?
Well, you've got so many embedded nodes now you can build using any of the technology. You've got the interconnection between the digital modes as well. So there's lots more to the landscape now than there was 20 years ago. So there's probably a lot to say about it. It could be, I don't know the publishing landscape right now, but it could be that some of that is already being covered in other books. But if you take the general topic of interconnecting amateur radio stations by voice over the internet, there's probably a lot to say.
I'm introducing you as somebody that does everything in ham radio. What kind of radio restoration have you done that you would like to share with the audience? What was probably the best lesson that you gleaned from a radio restoration project?
So I'm not nearly as good at it or as serious about it as a lot of very talented hams who do this as their main thing. I only have a few boat anchors, one of them being the HW101 that I built in 1977. And I've been trying to bring that back up to spec. I guess that's sort of if you're restoring your own stuff, is that considered a restoration project?
I think so. I mean, I've got a TS520 here that I know needs capacitors.
Yeah, okay.
That I've had for 45 years.
I love taking an old shortwave set or 5-tube, AC/DC radio and doing exactly that, recapping it, cleaning it up, fixing the dial lights and, restoring the power cord and that sort of thing. These are not major restoration projects. I'm not taking all the parts off the chassis and giving it an acid bath, but at least try to make it, work again, work like new, and make it look a little bit like new. I have one of those old Hallicrafters rigs. Is that an S33, I think? One of the very popular rigs, and got that up and running. I found actually a capacitor kit for it, which was very handy. And just doing a few things like that. So these are not major restoration projects, but just a few cases of cleaning things up.
There are people for some reason, there seems to be a new demand for the 5-tube super heterodyne radio in its original Bakelite case, if you can find it.
Yeah.
In my blog, I talk about a 9-year-old kid that comes to me every week for electronics. And for some reason, he just had a birthday, so I guess he's 10 years old now. He wanted a dial phone, a telephone with a dial on it, and he wanted a mechanical typewriter. So I'm trying to figure out, well, okay, where to get a dial phone. You can find them on eBay, but the Chinese are making dial phones. But I ended up having to give him a PBX from the attic in order to be able to allow him to call somebody using this dial phone. So
yeah, I wondered if the phone company still supported that.
I think the phone companies have to be backward compatible. You can buy these dial phones for about $60, $70 from a place called Temu, and they deliver in Israel in a week. So it's pretty interesting. But when you dial the numbers mechanically, it outputs DTMF.
Oh, okay. That's kind of cheating.
It's kind of cheating, yeah. It serves the purpose for the young man that wants to have the experience of...
Oh, sure. Of actually putting a finger in the dial. The first time one of my kids picked up an actual desk telephone. I have some, retro. I have some original Western Electric phones. He wasn't sure which way the receiver goes. Like, should the cord come out the top or out the bottom?
Isn't that interesting? And
Maybe it's
that
not
they're
obvious.
heavy, that there's actually a piece of lead in the handle in order to give it some weight.
Yeah, yeah. Well, you probably remember dialing numbers using the buttons on the phone. My parents, just the switch hook. My parents have a story about that. I was stuck in the basement one night. We used to live in this kind of a big old house. My parents had already gone to bed, and the door at the top of the stairs was locked. And I had learned how to ring our own phone from another extension using one of those tricks. And all I had was I didn't have a real phone in the basement. I had some toy thing, which didn't even have a dial, but it did have a button. And I just tapped out the numbers and was able to call my parents from the basement. So,
Right, with the switch hook, you could
yeah,
dial by playing with.
that's right. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's very interesting that so maybe there is a market for the old 5-tube heterodyne because people are starting to wax nostalgic about those old radios. I think that was as I recall in high school electronics, that was one of the requirements in the freshman year was to rip it down to its pieces and then rebuild it back up. What's your favorite operating mode?
My favorite mode is still CW. I love getting on 40 meters or 20 meters or 80 sometimes and working CW. I sort of like doing CW contests a little bit. Like I like doing CW once in a while. I'll do like 4 hours of a contest is about my limit. But current rig is an Elecraft K2 100, which I built quite a long time ago now, I guess, maybe 15 years ago.
That's the K2 with the 100-watt amplifier in the top lid.
That's right.
It's a beautiful radio.
I love it. It's always been pretty high performance, and I've never needed more than that. And it makes for a very good CW rig, full break-ins.
Oh, it was built by a guy that likes to do full break-in CW.
I guess it must have been.
Must have been. Do you do POTA or SOTA or anything like that with your ham radio?
I haven't done POTA, but I'm fascinated by it. And I think it's such a shot in the arm for amateur radio. I really admire the people who have gotten that thing going. And there are a couple of clubs around here which do those. And I'm looking forward, maybe when the weather gets warmer, and getting involved in that as well.
Do you operate digital modes at all besides CW as a digital mode?
I've done a little bit of digital modes. And I've experimented with writing a little software for it also. Of course, I was into RTTY since the 70s. In fact, I still have a Model 15 machine.
Oh, really?
But yes, I used to do a lot of PSK31. I've done a little bit of FT8, and I'm just sort of getting started with Vera as well, VeraChat, Verac.
Was that VARA, Vera?
Yes, yeah.
What is it and how does it work?
It's a software-based modem which works over either narrow or wideband, and the narrow band version of it fits into the HF bandwidth restrictions. So it's sort of an alternative to another digital mode like Pactor 3, for example, that's geared toward being able to send data at a pretty good rate over a very narrow channel, even in the presence of interference.
You could send a spreadsheet?
I guess you could. People do send images. That's been the hot thing right now. And it is, it's a much less expensive alternative to the licensing for the real high-speed digital modes like Pactor 3.
Right, where the modem itself is over $1,000 or something like that.
Probably, mostly due to IP licensing, I think.
Right. It doesn't. It's not that you couldn't write a modem program that would do it.
Yeah.
So it's something proprietary.
Yeah. So this is a really good alternative to that, and there's been a lot of interest in using it for various applications, just for sending data over HF, whether it's formal traffic handling or WinLink has been using it a little bit. So there's lots of different ways you can use any kind of a channel like that has those characteristics.
Right. It seems like if you were trying to send a list or something like that in a disaster situation over HF.
Right.
Yeah. Where the local repeater and the Echolink, the internet is gone, so the Echolink isn't working. Or it's my understanding that Echolink has been used for disasters.
It has been. In fact, some people have sent me a couple of TV news clips about this being actually making the news in the past. And again, those were situations where, and this is probably pretty typical, where a disaster is very localized. It affects only a specific disaster area, a certain city. And I think sometimes what happens is that the repeaters that are on the mountains at the edge of town are still working, even though maybe communications are disrupted in the disaster zone. And where the repeaters are working, there's people maybe on the other side of the mountains that still have internet access. So it doesn't mean that everything is down. It just means that certain pieces of it are. And that's where ham radio can fill in.
And now this mid-show break. Every 2 weeks, I listen to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast with George, KJ6VU, Vince, VE6LK, Mark, N6MTS, Thomas, K4SWL, Michael, VA3MW, and Rod, VA3ON, and their guest on often topical and important projects in amateur radio. This discussion amongst the regulars and their guests remind me of the conversations that I used to listen to on 146.94 and 146.46 megahertz in Orange County, California, while working on my own workbench almost 50 years ago. It is amazing how much practical ham radio knowledge that we can absorb by listening to the Workbench podcast that starts to make sense when we start our own deep dive into our own projects. So join me by listening to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast now and as George and crew push beyond 200 episodes. You can get to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast by clicking on the banner in this week's show notes page. And now, back to our QSO. It's my understanding that you're also a pilot.
I love to fly. I have a Cessna Skylane, a 2004 Skylane, which I keep here at Danbury Airport. And I really, that's my favorite thing to do. And to visit friends who are far away, to go out, take my bike with me and pedal around like out at Cape Cod or something. And I really, really appreciate it.
And it looks like you have a glass dashboard on that Skylane. Is that the picture or is that in another?
Yeah, that was the first year that Cessna offered that in the 182. It was 2004. I think it was an option in those days. Now it's on every new plane.
It's beautiful. It's beautiful.
It's called the G1000. It's all integrated avionics. And it was very, very cool about 15 years ago. Now it's only just slightly cool.
That's very good. And you cite in your QRZ page that you have 2 children that are future amateurs. How's that project going?
It hasn't gone very well. Amateur radio, has lost certainly some of its technology coolness factor. We all know how cool it is, but it's hard to convince people of that sometimes. Both of them are into their own things, and you never know when people will come back to something that they were introduced to on the periphery as a child, and they become interested later in life.
What could we do better to attract anyone? I used to think we should attract youngsters into amateur radio, but I think at this point, attracting anyone, since we live to be such old people, that anyone coming in their 30s probably could be 50 years in ham radio. What could we do better to bring people into amateur radio?
It's a great question, and I know that there's been lots of attempts to answer that, and you probably asked that question of all your guests. It's really, I don't have the answer to that. I think that there may be, it's possible that there'll be a certain backlash to all the screen time that we spend with all of our software and our communication, and that there'll be a lot of interest or some interest among some people in doing things with their hands, actually building something, getting the satisfaction of taking parts and putting them together and making something work. And I think that's something that is somewhat not unique, but is special to amateur radio that you don't get with other technologies. And I think that, taking sort of focusing on that uniqueness is probably the answer to differentiating ourselves from other kinds of technology interests.
The pendulum will swing in the other direction, and we'll all want hobbies one more time.
That's right. We want to actually pick something up that doesn't require being connected to somebody else all the time, and making something work sort of out of thin air. I think just building the equivalent of a crystal radio would be very cool to show that you can actually pick up something without even having a battery connected to it.
And we'll have to bring back AM radio stations.
I have to do that
for it to work. Yeah. But no, I think you're right. What do you think the greatest challenge to amateur radio is right now? Do you think that there's some force that wants to do us in?
Well, I notice, like everybody notices, that our target demographic, our current demographic, keeps increasing. And it's always been predominantly male, and it's probably folks older than I right now. So, the biggest challenge is how to get young people and females into amateur radio, I think, right now. And everybody will say the same thing probably, and nobody knows the exact answer to that. But I think we have to recognize that it isn't the same thing as it was in the 60s and 70s in terms of how it fits into the world and sort of the technology landscape. Mm-hmm. So we have to sort of do some fresh thinking about, different angles on it that can resonate with people in today's world.
I think you're absolutely right. I think I see that it's so different than it was in the 50s and 60s in terms of it can touch everything. Every technology that we do, that we could probably come up with an amateur radio angle.
Yeah, and thinking of it as a complementary technology rather than just something that has to exist in a vacuum, because it doesn't. It's going to thrive, I think, when it finds its way as an adaptation or a connection to other things.
If you meet a new ham, or you are talking to a ham that's been somebody from your junior high school amateur radio club who's been out of the hobby for years and years and is thinking about getting back in, what advice would you give them?
Yeah, I think I would say for them to try to take a fresh look at it and see how different it is now compared to the way it was when they were active, and see if any of those things resonate with them, like a lot of the modern digital modes and a lot of the different ways that you can interconnect amateur radio stations and the ways that we're using the internet. I think that would be something that they might not be aware of. They might think it's pretty much the same, or they might think it's totally dead, actually. They'd say, are people, because that's often the thing I say, I'm also an amateur radio operator. Somebody will say, oh, do people still do that?
I say that at the beginning of this show is that I frequently run into people that do the same thing. They have no idea. Israel was once, amateur radio was the only way to get out of Israel to talk to the States. And so every village had an amateur radio station. And with cheap long distance, they kind of disappeared. And so people thought that was the only reason that people did amateur radio, was to do phone patches.
Phone patches, yeah. South America was also big for that, yeah.
Right. So, and because of that, they think there's no reason. There's new legislation in the Knesset here. If you live in an apartment building, there's an apartment management group composed of volunteers, residents, who essentially decide what happens in the apartment building, who pays for the cleanup of the walk, who pays the elevator fees. So there's a Knesset law that's being considered now that overrides the VOD's ability to deny an amateur radio operator a wire antenna on the roof.
Nice.
So I think maybe that could be a renaissance of amateur radio.
It could be. Talking about the telephone and so on, it reminds me, one of my good friends from college met his wife on campus because she was trying to find an amateur radio operator who could help her communicate with her brother, who was based at the South Pole.
See, there you go.
And the only way to get in there was by ham radio. And she found a guy who was the president of the radio club, and she would come up to the club station once a week, and with him, she'd be the third party who spoke to her brother, and that's how they met.
Oh, that's amazing! And that was probably pre-satellite.
This would have been about 1980, 81 or so.
So there was a good reason. You mentioned that you're now retired. Are you still doing any professional work on the side?
I'm doing a little bit of freelance voiceover work. I set up a booth in the basement. It's amazing how much easier it is now than it was in the 80s.
It is amazing. And how is the voiceover business? Is it pretty good?
Yeah, I haven't really gotten critical mass on that yet. I've been doing one regular thing for a sports team, but I joined this online consortium. It's sort of like it's like a virtual talent agency called voices.com. There's a lot of opportunities, but also a lot of, the barrier to entry is so low now that anybody who's got a microphone and a computer can do voiceover work.
Right, that's right. Yeah. How about book reading?
Yeah, audiobooks is a possibility. I haven't pursued it seriously yet. I've still been a little bit in vacation mode, but I've taken a lot of notes on things that I can pursue. I've contacted some of my friends who are in the broadcast industry also.
Anyway, Jonathan, I want to thank you so much for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. I think it's a blast to talk about Echolink, and I think that was one of the reasons that I contacted you, is because I heard about this, and I've always wanted to talk to the father of Echolink, and that makes you a pioneer in voice over IP technology for ham radio.
Well, thanks a lot for giving me the chance to talk about it. Yeah.
73.
And to you as well.
That concludes this episode of QSO Today. I hope that you enjoyed this QSO with Jonathan. Please be sure to check out the show notes that include links and information about the topics that we discussed. Go to www.qsotoday.com and put in K1RFD in the search box at the top of the page. You may notice that some episodes are transcribed into written text. If you'd like to sponsor this or any of the episodes into written text, push the Sponsor Transcription button in the center of every show notes page. Support the QSO Today podcast by first joining the QSO Today email list by pressing the subscribe buttons on the show notes pages. I will not spam you or share your email address with anyone. Become a listener sponsor monthly or annually by clicking on the sponsor buttons on the show notes pages. Your value for value support is recognized on the QSO Today podcast and in the weekly show notes. If listener sponsorship is not for you, then please use our Amazon link when you shop on Amazon. Clicking on this link before you enter Amazon will allow Amazon to pay us a small commission on everything you purchase. This is a very painless way to support the QSO Today podcast, and it costs you nothing. QSO Today is syndicated on every podcast platform by using Podcast Index. Use the latest Podcast 2.0 player on your smartphone to automatically get to your podcast updates as soon as we publish. I'm now using Podverse to track, manage, and listen to my podcasts. Positive comments about QSO Today on social media is appreciated as it helps to grow our listener base. My thanks to Ben Bresky, who makes this podcaster and guests sound brilliant. Thanks, Ben. Until next time, this is Eric for Z1UG 73. The QSO Today podcast is a product of KEG Media Inc., who is solely responsible for its content.